G'day mate, 40 here. So life in the big city, people will run over you. And I mean that to begin with on a literal level, right? Far more pedestrians will get killed in the city by cars than by people dying inside of cars. So don't be dead right. And even though it is dead right to call Kamala Harris the DEI candidate, diversity, equity, inclusion candidate, it's not a winning line of attack. So don't be dead right. And the Democrats are also launching on a line of attack against Republicans that I don't think is a winning line of attack. And that is the weird label for Republicans. And Tom Friedman, the leftist columnist of the New York Times, points it out. It's a sophomoric, childish taunt that's going to backfire on Democrats because the key voters in this election are in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They're working class. They're the swing voters. And crafting a message filled with contempt, such as Republicans are weird, I don't think it's a winning message. And I think you're only likely to resonate with that message if you're living in a bubble, just as you're only likely to make the cat lady comments that J.D. Vance made if he's living in a particular online Tucker Carlson type bubble, right? J.D. Vance follows a lot of alt-right adjacent Twitter accounts, and he picked up that our country's run by childless cat ladies ideology from dissident right online posting. And it's usually an echo chamber, and it's not something you'd say if you're spending a considerable amount of time around other people who don't share your echo chamber. So Tom Friedman has a whole column, I think it came out yesterday, on why the weird taunt is likely to backfire on the Democrats. It's incredibly childish, and it's a cheap put down. It's coming from people who control the means of cultural production, right? It comes from the people who control what constitutes weird and what constitutes normal, right? It comes from people who went to Harvard, people who write for the New Yorker, people who work at CBS News, right? From these people who control the cultural means of production, they are going to follow their own hero system, and what looks weird to them, all right, it's not going to look weird to other people. It's not a winning formula to castigate Republicans as weird, because people on the margins, people in the middle, are not going to appreciate it, just like people in the middle are not going to appreciate J.D. Vance's taunt that America is run by childless cat ladies. So, life in the big city, man, you're going to get run down at any time. It's not sufficient that you have the right of way. It's not sufficient that there's a walk signal on, right? You step out onto the street, you got the walk signal. Don't be looking down at your phone, which I admit I still sometimes do, but I think less than average, because that's a recipe for leaving yourself wide open to getting hit. Because many drivers, you can turn right on a red light in California, they'll come up, they'll stop at the red light, and then they'll just automatically start turning into the crosswalk, and people will run over you. So you don't want to be dead right. Even when you're right, you can't take moral righteousness as the defining virtue that then decides all other categories. So I see the majority political opinion does this in foreign policy. I think to a neutral observer, Ukraine is in the moral right as against the conflict with Russia. But just because Ukraine's in the moral right, just because one naturally emotionally sides with Ukraine, does not mean that it's in America's best interest to subsidize Ukraine to the tune of over $100 billion and also then incentivize Russia to create mischief for American interests all over the globe. So if we hadn't been subsidizing Ukraine, it's much less likely that Hamas would have launched that attack into southern Israel. Right? Hamas was closely planning with Russia. They sent some of their top people to Russia prior to the attack, and Russia would not nearly have been as incentivized to create mischief for American interests all over the globe, including in the Balkans and the Middle East, if the US hadn't stepped into a fight that was none of its business. Australians often get into trouble when they come to the US and they see a fight going on, and they may want to interrupt it, or they may see someone getting mistreated, but there are certain fights that you don't want to get into. Even if it's clear that one side's the aggressor and the other side's the innocent party, right? You want to call 911, but you don't want to step into that fight. It's not in your interest, and it's not in the interest of the aggrieved party, because you may not be a person who's particularly well equipped with using his fists. So there are very violent parts of town in Los Angeles, and you don't want to expose much vulnerability. You want to spend as little time in these parts of town as possible, and when you are there, keep yourself small. Don't get involved in things that's none of your business. And Australians, right, coming from an overwhelmingly safe country where there's very little violent crime, they often get into trouble in the United States because they don't understand that a sizable proportion of the American population is highly physically dangerous, and you don't mess with them. So I notice people confuse categories all the time. So just because something is true doesn't mean that you say it out loud. Just because something is false does not mean that it's not a useful thing to say out loud. Does not mean it's not a useful strategy. Chris LaCivita, who's running the Trump campaign, he launched the Swift Boat campaign against John Kerry in 2004, which, whatever its merits on the basis of truth, was highly effective politics. So I saw Molly Jong-Fast on MSNBC this morning say that J.D. Vance only wants Americans to have white children, which is a weird thing to say given that J.D. Vance has 3 non-white children with his Indian wife. So how would a nice person like Molly Jong-Fast, I've interviewed her, she's the nicest person, all right? She's empathetic, she's warm, she's really good at seeing things from other people's point of view, all right? Genuinely nice person, great neighbor, good conversationalist. You'd enjoy being at a dinner party with her, even if your politics are diametrical to hers. But how on earth would she come out with a stupid statement like J.D. Vance is only interested in Americans having white children? And that's because she lives in an echo chamber, and this is a talking point that she's picked up in her echo chamber. So we have to simultaneously live inside our bubble and outside of it. So that means a good life is lived within a strongly identifying in-group, whether that's Orthodox Jews, as in my case, or maybe it's attorneys or doctors or evangelical Christians, in your case, right? We should all have a life filled with a powerful in-group identity. And, right, when we have that strong in-group identity, right, these ties bind us together with other people, but they also blind us. Ties with others bind us and blind us, as Jonathan Haidt says. But there is a way to navigate, and that is just to take a little time out to consider how would what I am saying and doing, or how would what my group is saying and doing look like to other people. So, for example, I'm an Orthodox Jew, I'm a strong Zionist, and a normal person who doesn't have a partisan perspective is going to be appalled by all the suffering going on in Gaza, right? You would have to be weird not to have some empathy for the approximately 38,000 dead Gazans since Israel fought back from the October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas. So even though it's suffering on the other side, and even though you personally, as a committed Zionist, may not particularly care about the suffering of the enemy, right, a normal, unbiased person will have empathy for thousands of dead Gazans. And there are certain practices in Orthodox Judaism which, from an outside perspective, look weird, tribal, primitive, and you're simply going to be more effective in life if you're able to stop your in-group identification, just pause for a few seconds, right, even in the middle of identifying with your in-group, and think, how does this look like to the Latino help? Or how does this look like to non-Jewish neighbors? How does this look like to secular Jewish neighbors? Right? What are going to be the consequences of my words and behavior? And this is a helpful perspective as well on yourself and how you're using yourself. So you get caught up in the moment, you become fascinated by something in the news, you are entranced by romantic options, you are energized by a challenge at work. But if you pause and take note, how is this affecting my use of myself? Am I pulling down? Am I tightening? Am I compressing? Am I tilting to the right? Do I have way too much tension in my ankles or in my shoulders or in my wrists, around my eyes, around my lips, in my head, in my neck? Right? How am I using myself? Because you cannot think a thought without that rippling through your body. Right? You will inherently start tightening and compressing, and there'll be some element of pulling down when you simply think a thought. But if you can take a pause and just notice what your tension and compression patterns are, you can let them go. When you start letting them go, right, first you have to notice the unnecessary tension and compression, and then you start to let it go, and then there's a tremendous surge of freedom. The breath comes easier. You move more efficiently. So, for example, a way to walk more gracefully is to say, I'm not walking, because that gets you out of your habitual ways of doing things. And when you belong to a strongly identifying in-group, right, you learn habitual ways of doing things that don't serve you. So even the thought, I'm not thinking, I'm not live streaming, right? When I say that right now, I am not live streaming, right? I get a smile on my face, and there's a change in the quality of my voice. And that is matched by an increased openness in my face and in my thinking, and my vision just opened up. So when we become particularly engaged with one thing, we tend to tighten and compress around it, and our vision narrows. But when I tell myself, hey, I'm not live streaming, then my vision widens, and I move, at least for a few seconds, from a state of judgment into just a state of awareness. And most of the time, we're going to be far better off simply being in a state of awareness rather than a state of judgment. Obviously, there are times when you have to judge. There's a time and a place for judgment, but most of the time, you're just far better off being in a state of awareness, just noticing what's going on and letting go of your compulsions, fixations, which will tend to tighten, compress you down around your particular fixation. So, speaking of compulsions and fixations, the acting head of the United States Secret Service and a top bloke from the FBI were testifying to Congress today. And the acting head of the U.S. Secret Service said the Secret Service agent in charge of security at the Trump rally where Trump got shot, the one who deliberately made the decision not to have somebody stationed on top of the building where the sniper Crooks was, right? That guy, he's still out there securing protection for the U.S. Secret Service. So for all we know, he's out there securing protection for Donald Trump after the most epic screw-ups. I mean, in what universe does this happen, right? Would this happen in private business? There's a great interview with Eric Prince of Blackwater talking about all the security failures in the Trump assassination attempt that just hit YouTube about a day ago. And he gave a really good rundown. It's quite difficult to integrate Donald Trump's private security with the U.S. Secret Service, right? The Secret Service will do everything they can to make the private security look stupid. So if the private security takes a shot or doesn't take a shot, the U.S. Secret Service will try to ensure that the private security gets the blame. They'll try to make the private security feel like they're in the way. They'll blame the private security for anything they possibly can. And so it's hard to integrate private security. What Eric Prince suggested was that Donald Trump employ professional sniper teams to design ways that they would attack him at various rallies, and then share those plans with the Secret Service to make sure that the top 10 or top 20 ways that a sniper would attack Donald Trump are protected against. One item from the under news that doesn't get a lot of attention, but that Mark Halperin talks about regularly, is the mental health crisis on the left. So if you're on the left, you're much more invested in moral categories such as racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, and the like. And your moral focus is on society, not just your own individual behavior. And so your locus of control is outside of yourself. And this precipitates people to mental health problems such as depression and anxiety. And so the prospect of Donald Trump winning is filling, millions of American leftists with great apprehension and anxiety. And if Donald Trump does win, right, they will be plunged into debilitating depression, right? Many of them will be unable to show up to work. If they do show up to work, they'll be crying. They're going to fall apart. They are used to the left running almost all of our institutions, right? They're used to the liberal left hero system being the dominant hero system in society. And so with the rise of Donald Trump, and more importantly, the rise of a counter-elite that doesn't accept the liberal left hero system, all right, they are facing an unprecedented challenge to the supremacy of their hero system. And so I notice in my own conversations with leftists, when I mentioned that the moral category of racism is simply made up, that there's no such moral sin as racism, is something that's made up in the last 100 years, particularly in the last 60 years, doesn't have any resonance with reality or with history, that none of the great moral thinkers in history were concerned about racism. They are just speechless. They don't know what to do with that. They don't know how to interact with it. They don't know how to counter it. They just look lost at sea. Just like someone from a strongly identifying Amish in-group who is out of his group and trying to make his way in New York City is going to feel lost. And so there was an article in the Washington Post yesterday, 8 occasions when you should not forgive. And one of the occasions it listed for why you should not forgive is if someone has committed an infraction of racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and the like against you. That you should not forgive that because you are standing up for the moral categories of racism, ageism, sexism, etc. And I was just thinking, what an incredibly self-destructive way to live. So the best definition of forgiveness that I find works in real life is that it's simply a decision to release, right? It's simply a decision to stop obsessing over something. It's a decision to stop replaying a hurt that somebody has done to you. It is a decision to release your desire to enforce unenforceable rules, right? When we can't forgive, when we can't get over some hurt that someone's done us, that's because we are trying to write them up, to give them tickets for breaking our unenforceable rules, such as, I forgot a phone call this morning. I had a scheduled phone call at 6 a.m. I completely forgot it. I'm not proud of that. It's fairly rare, But if someone became obsessed that I'd done that to them, right, and wrote me up a ticket for breaking their unenforceable rules, right, that would not serve them.